Happy Friday. I'm not going to waste your time today. We have some start sit options for week 9. Drop any additional players or questions in the comments and I'll answer them as quickly as I possibly can. But without further ado, this is the Anomaly Podcast, week 9. Let's get into it. Starting off here with a quick little recap, as on the left side of your screen, the very left, we're going to have all of the players from last Friday's video. On the right side, of course, if you see a yellow strip, we're kind of in the middle. I can see both sides of the argument, but of course, green strip, we got it right. Red strip, we got it wrong. Of course, we always like to keep ourselves accountable. But overall, out of the 12 or so players I gave you guys, 5 right, 4 in the middle, and 3 wrong. No doubt our worst week on the season, but we're going to bounce back here pretty soon. Starting off with the quarterback position, we're going to start with none other than Joe Burrow. He's coming off his best game on the season, no doubt, as he had 320 total yards and 3 touchdowns through the air, 28 fantasy points roughly last week. But no doubt, there's going to be a tough matchup this weekend, Sunday night football, against the Buffalo Bills. That game could be one to remember. Regardless, Joe Burrow has thrown for multiple touchdown passes in 3 straight games. A fully healthy Joe Burrow is a must-start quarterback because that's a top 3 player in the NFL. And he looks fully healthy again. Again, last week he had like 50 rushing yards. So if you needed a reason to believe he's fully back to full health, that would be it, as that calf looks better than ever. But the Bills defense, this is a defense that's given up more than 19 fantasy points to guys like Mac Jones and Baker Mayfield in the last 2 weeks, back to back. The Bengals are back, and it looks like so is Joe Burrow. And given the Bills' recent history against quarterbacks, Joe Burrow is a must start this weekend. Sunday Night Football. So you want to start your studs in a game like that. But how about his teammate, Joe Mixon? Again, this is relatively easy. I'm going to start him this week. He's coming off his best game of the season. The Bills have allowed the 12th most fantasy points to running backs. It should be a shootout. Again, one to remember, hopefully, for a better reason. We're going to start Joe Mixon this week. But let's get back to the quarterback. As Will Levis, of course, I'm recording this a day early as I want to get this out before tonight's game. But last week in his debut, he stepped in for an injured Ryan Tannehill. 238 passing yards, 4 touchdowns. I love the debut game from Will Levis as he was shocking the world. And he's now maybe put himself in a position where he could be the guy for Tennessee going forward. However, this weekend, he does have a much tougher test. Not against a soft Atlanta defense, but against a veteran-led, T.J. Watt-led Steelers defense. So it's going to be a big matchup here for Will Levis. But again, the Steelers, they generate pressure at one of the highest rates in the NFL, running a lot of press man coverage. So it's going to be a good test game for Will Levis because coming into the season, we knew that the questions were about his accuracy, not his arm strength. And this week, he's going to have to show a lot of accuracy against this hard-nosed, in-your-face Steelers defense. Again, I think it's too premature to start Will Levis. Now, if you want to roster him, sure. We talked about him on Wednesday. But as far as starting him, it's too premature for me, especially against a defense like this. Make him prove it one more time before he hits our starting lineups. But the 50-50 player of the week is our last quarterback on today's show, Dak Prescott. I want to know your guys' opinion down in the comments. Again, he's playing an Eagles defense that, in big matchups, the Cowboys either blow the team out or they are blown out. There's kind of no shootouts with the Dallas Cowboys. But this game is lining up to be a shootout, at least on paper. So I want your guys' opinion in the comments. The Cowboys should throw a lot if they're getting blown out or not. And the Eagles have the 25th defense against the quarterback position this season. So I want your guys' opinion in the comments. What should we do with Dak Prescott? But at the running back position, we're going to start with Josh Jacobs. And I know this might be fairly obvious to you. However, to some people, it's not. And I'm going to explain why I would start Josh Jacobs despite the quarterback change and the head coaching change and all the crazy stuff that's going on in Las Vegas. Josh Jacobs, I'll say this to start. He's failed to live up to my preseason expectations. I figured with a check down specialist and Jimmy Garoppolo coming over, I figured it coming off of the season he had. This is a guy, Josh Jacobs, that could have a top 3, top 5 running back level, season finish. But that just hasn't, he just hasn't been that good of a player this season. But given that, though, he has also been a safe play. He hasn't been the top 5 option we like, but he's still been a very safe play. He scored more than 16 fantasy points in 3 of his last 5 games, and he has scored fewer than 9 fantasy points only once this season. So he is a very safe floor despite the not very high ceiling. And this week he's facing a Giants defense that has allowed the 5th most rushing yards and the 3rd most rushing touchdowns and 9th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Given the quarterback change from Jimmy Garoppolo to Aiden O'Connell, I think that's only actually going to help him this week. I don't think it changes his upside too much. But given, the only game that Aiden O'Connell, played with Josh Jacobs this year, you see the stats on the top right of your screen. He had 8 receptions, 140 total yards, and 1 touchdown, setting himself up for a very nice fantasy day, his best game on the season. So I think Jacobs is a must start this week, as they're going to rely on him more and more than they ever have going on for the remainder of the season. But for this week specifically with the quarterback change, start Josh Jacobs. Don't think twice about it. We're going to kick off here with some receivers. I'm going to go through 6 receivers here, 3 sits, 3 starts. Let's get into it. For Rasheed Shaheed, last week, of course, had an amazing day, but I'm going to sit him this week against, I believe, the Chicago Bears. I talked about him a lot on yesterday's show, but this is just a Marquise Goodwin kind of stat line that he had last week, where they have a low amount of receptions, but with big play after big play, they end up with a ton of yards, maybe even a touchdown or 2, and all your fantasy mates are rushing to grab this player on the waiver wires. But look, no doubt, he had an amazing day. Again, 25 fantasy points. I'm sure, his owned percentage shot up by at least 15-20%. However, it was 3 receptions at the end of the day on 5 targets. Okay, everything that could have went right did for Rasheed Shaheed last week. And at the end of the day, you're going to be hoping for this guy to catch a deep streak or deep post multiple times a game, and that's just a very tall. That's a tall order from a guy that is really just a field stretcher. For reference, this is a guy that has 4 games this season where he has scored under 7 fantasy points. So it's just not a risk that I'd be willing to take on a weekly basis. So I would sit him despite the Chicago Bears matchup. Now, hey, if Rasheed Shaheed comes out this week and he has a monster day where he has 7 receptions for 70 yards and maybe a touchdown or 2, then it's no doubt a start going forward. But for right now, he just looks like a big play guy, and you never want to start guys like that because you could get 0 on a weekly basis. At the next, we're going to talk about Christian Watson, our second sit receiver on the week. He's been a disappointment this year, and there's no doubt about it. A large part of that could be leaned on his injury, but when he has played, he has been insignificant is a good way to put it, as he has reached 12 fantasy points, or he hasn't reached 12 fantasy points in any game this season, and he has been held to fewer than 7 in a game the last 2 weeks. And on top of that, Jordan Love has thrown 3 interceptions while targeting Christian Watson this season, and he has a career low passer rating while doing so. So there could be some chemistry issues there with the quarterback. Again, Jordan Love hasn't looked the greatest since like the first 2-3 weeks of the season, and that's coming from a Jordan Love stan. But Romeo Doubs and Jada Reed have definitely been more efficient options, and Jordan Love seems to favor those guys over a big body receiver like Christian Watson. So no doubt, Christian Watson always has that big play threat ability, but those big plays have been very few and far between. You see his stats on the top right, very minimal impact on our fantasy teams this year. And just with Jordan Love at the helm, until they can turn this ship around and get back to the direction they were early in the season, I would sit Christian Watson until further notice, even given the couple bye weeks that we have this week. The last sit receiver here this week, and this one hurts. I went back and forth with this one, but even though I love the player, I think he was on pace to be the rookie of the year. I had him as that before the season. I'm going to sit Jordan Addison this week, in a favorable matchup against the Falcons. As, look, Kirk Cousins is done for the year. They just traded for Josh Dobbs. And given that fact, Jaren Hall, the rookie quarterback, is going to get his first ever career start this week. Again, a favorable matchup against the Falcons. We just saw Will Levis in the same situation last week, making his debut against a favorable Atlanta matchup. And he killed it. He had a monster day. But that's just a tall task to ask 2 weeks in a row from Jaren Hall. So given the fact that, given the quarterback situation for Jordan Addison, even though they have a favorable matchup, I would just play it safe this week. So if you can sit Jordan Addison, I would do that. But given the bye weeks, maybe you have, some guys for Denver or a couple receivers from Detroit. You might have to start Jordan Addison, and it wouldn't be a bad play. I would just steer away if you have another option that you like. Josh Downs, how about that? Another rookie wide receiver, but we're going to start him as he has scored more than 13 fantasy points in 4 straight games. He's averaging 16 fantasy points per game over the last month. To put that in perspective, some other guys that have done that are Mike Evans, Brandon Ayuk, and even Jordan Addison that we just talked about. Most of you guys are no doubt, you aren't even thinking about it. You're starting those guys on a weekly basis, so you should be starting Josh Downs. I know he's not the number 1 option in this offense, but he seems to have a connection with Gardner Minshew. And I know Minshew's a little banged up right now, but he should be ready to go for Sunday. And Josh Downs, to me, is a start this week. Another rookie wide receiver, we're going to talk about Rasheed Rice. Of course, he had a down week last week, but given that fact, he still had 9.6 fantasy points in a full PPR. And let's not forget, he did that with Pat Mahomes going through a flu. Again, given the down week, Rasheed Rice led the teams in snaps, routes ran, targets, receptions, and receiving yards. He's clearly the wide receiver one there in Kansas City, and there's no doubt about it. They're in Germany this week against the Dolphins team that's going to score a lot of points, so the Chiefs are going to have to keep up. So this should be a shootout. It should be lined up that way at least. And if that is the case, you're going to want any part of that game, at least, within reason. And especially if you can get a wide receiver one in your lineups, I would start Rasheed Rice and over guys like Jordan Addison, Christian Watson, and guys of that nature. So start Rasheed Rice this week in Germany against the Miami Dolphins defense, even though he might, line up against Jalen Ramsey. But you have Andy Reid. He's very creative at getting his playmakers the ball. At the tight end position, we'll close off here with Trey McBride as a breakout game. It's an understatement for Trey McBride last week. 10 receptions, 95 yards, a touchdown or two. Overall, 25 fantasy points. So very big day for Trey McBride. We talked about him yesterday on the show as we talked about his upside for the remainder of the season, especially when Kyler Murray returns. However, for this week, there is no shot that Kyler Murray is going to be making his return game against the best defense in football. So that leaves the rookie, Clayton Tune, to make his first career start against the best defense in football, of course, in the Cleveland Browns. I could see this game getting out of hand pretty early, not to mention that it's in Cleveland. So Clayton Tune on the road, first game against the best defense in football, is going to have to make players fantasy relevant, and I just don't see that happening. Now, his number one option should be Trey McBride over Marquise Brown, but I do think the Browns know that as well. We have a very talented linebacker group. We should be able to shut down Trey McBride, and I think this will be the dud of the week as a lot of people are picking him up, and they're probably going to start him given the bye weeks. But I see the upside. I just wouldn't start him against the Browns this week, if that makes any sense. Again, this is a defense that shut down George Kittle. So I'm going to play it on the side of caution here, and I'm going to sit Trey McBride given the quarterback situation. How about Jake Ferguson, though? Jake Ferguson in the tough NFC East matchup against the Eagles, maybe game of the year. We've talked about it earlier with Dak Prescott, but I will start Jake Ferguson while I am in question about Dak Prescott. But I set out a challenge for Jake Ferguson last week, as I did with Dallas Goedert early in the season, and Jake Ferguson answered the call. And again, he had like 4 receptions, 40 yards, and a touchdown. A very solid day. So given that, I'm going to double down this week. The Cowboys will likely have to throw a lot in the matchup against the Eagles. And Jake Ferguson, he should have a pretty big day given that CeeDee Lamb is going to be heavily covered. So I'm doubling down this week. Don't let me down, Jake Ferguson, as if you do, you might also be back on the hot seats. And finally here, we're going to talk about another rookie. I really didn't realize how many rookies we had on this video until this point, but we have a ton of them, right? We have at least 5 of them. But for Dalton Kade, last week, 5 receptions, 65 yards, 17.5 fantasy points, being a top 5 tight end option on the week. But look, this week's Sunday Night Football, it's the Bills, it's the Bengals, could be game of the year. No shocker, right? No, guys don't need an explanation for that game. But Kincaid, he has come on strong in the absence of Dawson Knox, and there's no reason he doesn't continue to dominate in this game, given that Stephon Diggs will be heavily covered. So surefire start for me. Not much explanation needed behind this one. Start Dalton Kincaid. He's hot, and he's playing in a high-powered offense. But that's going to do it here for today's video, as again, we ran through 12 or so players for this upcoming week in Week 9. If you enjoyed, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, share the podcast. I want to thank you guys because we are now at 1,400 subscribers, 1,500 maybe at this point. I cannot imagine, it's hard to fathom the growth that we've had on this channel in the last month. So I want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart. But again, we're on the road to 2,000 subs. If you want to join the crew, join the channel, go ahead and support us down below. But we'll be back next Tuesday with, of course, another podcast. So until then, good luck to your fantasy teams this weekend. Good luck to your real-life teams this weekend, of course, unless you're a Cardinals fan. And until Tuesday, stay happy, stay healthy, get out of here.